Now, we must be careful not to misunderstand Schelling on this point. This immediate presence of God, which we have said is expressed in non-dualistic mysticism, and which is the earliest stage of religious development, is not gone, it's not non-existent. It is rather the ground of the present. So it subsists in a certain way, not as actuality, but as the antecedent or support of actuality. So in that regard, it's always with us, and we need not look very far to find it. And I'd like to think that we could qualify Schelling's critique by saying a momentary return to the oceanic bliss of undivided unity with God is always possible for us. Indeed, it might even be necessary for psychological health, so long as it is not mistaken for reality. That is, so long as it is not absolutized, so long as it does not become an exclusive claim. So non-dualistic mysticism is only a problem on this line when it denies personality, when it denies time, when it denies history, when it becomes apolitical and ahistorical. But a non-dualistic mystical experience, which in a genuinely non-dualistic fashion does not exclude its opposite, would be something perfectly legitimate from a Schellingian perspective. I think we could call this an inclusive mysticism rather than an exclusive mysticism. An inclusive mysticism which includes the non-mystical, which includes the historical, the political, the personal, and so on, which includes the active life. So a contemplative life that does not refuse activity, but on the contrary, finds in its activity the fullness of its expression. Now, the other way in which we try to go back is nationalism. And I've written about this extensively elsewhere, so I draw your attention to the article Populism and the Late Schelling on Mythology, Ideology, and Revelation, which I published in Analecta Hermeneutica in 2017. If nationalism is constituted by the positing of gods who stand in some kind of competitive relationship with the gods of others, if this mythological move is necessary for consolidating a relative collective identity over and against other collectivities, then a return to nationalism at this stage in our history can only be a regression, every bit as much a regression as the retreat from reality, which is non-dualistic, exclusive non-dualistic mysticism. And so we notice that today, all around the world, as nationalism takes hold of various democracies, a return to the tribal gods, a return to the symbolisms of the past, whether it's Xi Jinping invoking Confucian China, or Putin returning to some kind of Soviet imperialism, or Trump trying to make America great again by pitting it against everyone else. We see the same mythological move, the same demonization of the other, the same mythologization of the political, even in some cases the same return to the gods of the old world, as in Modi's BJP India. But just as there is an inclusive mysticism, which I think is not only legitimate but somehow required by the law of the ground, so too is there an inclusive nationalism, which is required by the law of the ground. Schelling is not necessarily saying that we should dismantle the nation state, that we should regard our national identities and our cultural symbols as somehow obstacles to peace and living together on a small planet. We know for a fact that Schelling was deeply critical of international communism. So I think that we need to make room here in our expansion of Schelling for something like an inclusive nationalism. That is, an affirmation of national identity with all of the religious historical context that requires. So in some respects, a veneration for the national gods, a veneration and a preservation of the national symbols, which, however, does not simply try to return back to that period in history when we were divided from others in terms of competing deities. So a nationalism which does not deny the possibility that you too could have your national gods, your national symbols, your national tradition. In other words, a nationalism that could coexist with the nationalisms of others. And I think this would be the kind of internationalism that would most appeal to Schelling. So Schelling, I think, is pointing towards a coming unity, but this unity will not be by virtue of negating those things which have distinguished us in the past, religion, history, national heritage, but rather of affirming them in a non-competitive way. National identity will remain the ground of the new community to come. The internationalism to come will not bring with it new gods. It's not another version of nationalism, let's say on a global scale. Rather, it transcends nationalism as such. It is the consequence of nationalism. And all of these national identities which have developed over time out of religious history, they will remain the ground of the community to come. And so everything depends upon them remaining ground and grounding the new community rather than usurping the consequent and becoming perversely actualized. Schelling is using philological methods to reconstruct the earliest origins of humanity, the event of our becoming human, if you like. And as such, he is besaddled by insurmountable methodological obstacles. He's trying to reconstruct an event by which we became conscious and free beings. Now, the event by which I became conscious cannot itself be a conscious act. Do you remember the beginning of adolescence and the end of infancy? No, of course you don't. Because when infancy was ending, you weren't actually there as an adolescent. Similarly, the act by which I become free is not itself a free act. Freedom begins in necessity, just as consciousness begins in the unconscious. So this event in consciousness, which Schelling is so desperately trying to reconstruct for us, is beset by paradoxes because it is not a conscious event at all. It is the event of consciousness. It's something that happens, certainly, but it happens within consciousness and not in history, because the consequent of the event is the entrance into history. When the event happened, we were not historical beings. After the event, we became historical. Let's conclude this podcast with a short reflection on who the Jews are in this history of religion. As Schelling says over and over again, and as we've discussed, the Jews are the non-people. The Jews are not part of this general trajectory of the coming to be of God through a construction of nations competing with one another. The Jews, in fact, are set aside. To them is entrusted the memory of the one God. They too have to pass through a process of coming to understand how the one God is essentially not just accidentally one. That is, the one God is the God of all people and the God of all gods because there is nothing outside of him. They too have to pass through a stage of relative monotheism en route to becoming absolutely monotheists. And this process really doesn't come to a completion for the Jews until the Jews give rise to Christianity and Trinitarianism. But in their earliest beginnings, they are set aside and entrusted with an anticipation of the God to come. And I'd like to draw your attention to the futurity of Judaism for Schelling. While the pagan people look back to the past in their religious experience, they remember who the gods are and their origin in the theogony. Polytheistic national identities are consolidated around a mythological reconstruction of an event of the gods, a mythological remembering of who their gods are. The Jews look to something that is still to come. The God of the Jews, revealed to Moses in the statement in Exodus 3:14, I am who I am, is a God who is not yet completely actual. In fact, that Hebrew can even be translated as I am who I will be. I am who I will be, which could be interpreted as I am whoever I will to be, or I am the one who is to come. I am the one who will be the God of all people in the future. And I think this is how Schelling wishes to understand the Jews as a people who really do not have an actual God, but who are in the process towards, or in a pilgrimage towards, an actual God. Turn to Lecture 7 then, page 120, we have this. We have previously explained the name of Jehovah as the name of the one who is becoming. Perhaps this was its first meaning, but according to that explanation of Moses, it is the name of he who is in the future, of he who now is only becoming, who will be in the future. And also all his promises are directed at the future. Everything that Abraham was privileged to receive are promises. To him who is not now a nation, it is promised that he shall become a great and powerful nation. Indeed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed by him. for in him lay the future of that monotheism through which in the future all presently dispersed and separated nations shall again be united." End quote. This promise of a unity to come is not the promise of a future nation-state of Israel. The unity to come is the unity of all people under one God, and it will not be a return to the old unity, the unity that was by virtue of the exclusion of difference. It will be an advance towards a unity that has never yet existed, because the differentiations necessary for bringing it about are not yet complete. A unity that is by virtue of difference, a unity that is enriched by difference, a unity whose symbol will be the Trinity, a God who is one by virtue of being three, and whose threeness does not preclude his oneness.